Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night.
Hello again, and welcome to Blondes and Bombshells Class 13, Female Portrayals in Children's Media. I'm your host, Professor Saporin, ready as always to give you the lowdown on the history of female depictions in mass media culture. Before we get started, I'd like to go over the responses to the questions I asked you all last time. The results are in, so let's see how things turned out. First of all, with the question of whether or not the original Terminator movie should be cut from the curriculum for future semesters, despite a few highly compelling individual responses to the contrary, and a few honest admissions of having skipped the viewing. Slackers! Thank you for being good slackers. We appreciate your honesty, and as promised, none of you lost any points. The overwhelming majority of students seem, however, to have been fairly adamant that the film should not be cut from the curriculum, with one student suggesting what I consider a very intelligent compromise, which I will be following in future semesters, so thank you. That compromise, in case you were curious, was to keep the film in the curriculum, but to accompany it with a trigger warning. I intend to do exactly this, and to make it possible for anyone who has any issue that would cause, undue stress, cause them any kind of problems from viewing the film, to opt out and maybe be given an alternate assignment, like reading a spoilerific plot description, or if I can find such a film, have them watch another film that covers the same primalist principles without all the shooty murder robots. Maybe by the time I teach this class again next spring, such a film will have been made. Let's hope. Anyway, on to the results for the other question that I asked you. What should be done to fix the sexual burden / gender imbalanced sexualization in filmic portrayals? First of all, again, in spite of a small number of well-articulated and highly compelling arguments in favor of shutting down the filmic sexualization of both genders in general, the overwhelming majority of students seem to have responded in favor of sexualizing both genders equally, with a variety of suggestions as how best to go about doing so. Incidentally, this being apparently a class predominantly of heterosexual women, I do wonder whether the answer to that question was somehow influenced by our last class video, and whether it would have been different had I asked you guys this question before I showed you all the clips of the sexy men. But I digress. Now, the idea that there was widespread opposition to censoring out sexualization in film doesn't really surprise me. We live in a highly censorship-averse culture, and for better or for worse, the notion of censorship goes against our American core value of free speech. What did surprise me, however, was to see how the vast majority of people who voted to sexualize both genders equally also stipulated that they felt like both genders should be sexualized, but less so, or that films needed to desexualize or de-escalate the sexualization of characters of both genders. Overall complaining that the level of sexualization in film had gotten out of hand, and expressing a consistent sentiment that these scenes are tiresome, overdone, uninteresting, and perhaps even likely to result in negative body image issues for viewers of both genders. I think a very valid point. The conversation on body image tends to only focus on women, often to the exclusion of men, but men often have very similar issues as a result of the unrealistic filmic portrayals, especially young men, and it's, a very real, all too common, and very serious issue regardless of gender. But what was particularly interesting to me, back to our class's little opinion poll, was that these same people, the majority of respondents who said that we should tone down sexual portrayals in film, also said that they understood that these types of portrayals needed to be kept in films in order to sell, that films simply wouldn't make money if they didn't include sex scenes, so sex scenes were therefore a kind of necessary evil, apparently put there for other people, with the rest of us just having to tolerate them. Now, this was particularly interesting to me. If the vast majority of people in this class are in favor of keeping sex scenes in movies, apparently for the benefit of some other people, not themselves, who enjoy them, I wonder, do the majority of people actually enjoy sex scenes? Or is this some grand Hollywood misconception that we've all been awkwardly tolerating, cringing privately to ourselves in theaters as we presume that everyone else around us is having a better time than we are? I wonder. Even given that this is a predominantly female class, and as we've discussed, the vast majority of sexualization in film happens to female characters, this same idea was independently articulated even by a lot of the male respondents, which I admit is a relatively smaller sample size in this class, but still seems to point to the significance of this idea being shared across gender lines. I figure it's either that a much larger number of people than I would have guessed secretly agree that there's just way too much sex in film, or that you're all just a bunch of secret perverts who didn't want to admit that you actually do enjoy sex scenes and blamed, wanting to see their existence continued on some fictional other people. I wasn't sure. So, for tonight's attendance assignment, I want you to do the following. Email me again right now with the answer to this question. Do you personally enjoy sex scenes in movies? I don't want to know about anyone else or what you believe other people want. I want to know about you. Now, if this is too personal a question, that's fine. Feel free to just email me the phrase no comment or something to that effect. That's perfectly acceptable so long as I know that that's what you're doing. But, pause the video and go do that right now. Okay, you did it? Good. Now let's get back to what we were saying about fixing the sexual burden in film. There were a few more particularly insightful comments that I feel warrant raising here. One student suggested that sexual portrayals in film need to be based much more on consent and agency. Good for you. And argued quite cogently, I thought, that we need more portrayals of healthy consensual sex in films. This student argued that depicting agency and healthy sexual expression for all genders was a good way to model healthy sexual behavior to film audiences, hopefully towards normalizing a healthier idea of romantic and sexual expression to people in reality. This idea of behavioral modeling was something that we read about this week in the famous compilation of behavioral science research studies by Judith Van Evera, Television and Child Development. So keep that in your minds for now. We'll be coming back to this later. Another student suggested that greater diversity behind the camera would of course help solve the issue of the sexual burden in film scenes by bringing in different cinematic gazes and a wider variety of perspectives on who is sexually attractive so as to better reflect reality in our media. I think that's a good idea too. Another student suggested a pretty groundbreaking, radical, and I think bold new idea to encourage the sexualization of actors only when the actors themselves are comfortable being sexualized, citing examples like Sandow the Strongman as someone who obviously enjoyed putting himself on display. The consensual nature of the Sandow example stands in stark contrast, I think, to the often toxic pressure and expectation put on actors and particularly actresses to self-sexualize for the camera, sometimes in upsetting, badly handled, and consent-violating ways, like the scene from The Group and The Wild Bunch that I discussed in a previous episode. And even as we have discussed, when playing characters for whom sexual scenes are unnecessary or even antithetical to the filmic content and or character being portrayed, that is, like Rey from Star Wars. As I wrote in my response to the student, it is so unfortunately rare to discuss actors' desires, preferences, or consent. In fact, this is generally not even a consideration, not remotely part of the conversation. Actors are simply expected to kind of act like tools and do whatever they're told, as if directors assume that this has no consequences to them as human beings. I think this is very interesting and a pretty irresponsible presumption, to say the least. Because, not even just in terms of sexuality, method actors can, really mess themselves up, for example, by playing suicidal characters for too long a period of time. Getting too deep into those characters can have really negative psychological effects. Actors are often expected to do basically anything without limits for the privilege of getting a part, and as we've discussed, these issues disproportionately affect female actors, especially in terms of sexual expectations, and perhaps it's a bit dismal to realize that these ideas, could even be considered radical. But they are. The idea that filmmakers would actually consider actors' feelings when it comes to filming sex scenes, approaching actors as if they were, human beings, equals, people with preferences about how their own bodies are used? I mean, it's kind of crazy to realize that these ideas are just not considered at all when it comes to the production of Hollywood film and other mainstream media. The idea of having a respectful discussion where everyone could articulate their personal space boundaries, the idea of letting actors help determine these boundaries, and whether a certain portrayal, or a given sex scene were more explicit or more implied, this would certainly help break the often toxic expectations put upon actresses in the film industry, and this issue is likely a crucial part of why the sexual burden and gender nudity bias still continue to exist on film. Actresses are discouraged from complaining about unequal treatment and unequal portrayals. The idea is kind of to shut up and strip when the director tells you to, which sadly shouldn't really surprise us coming from an industry with its fair share of Harvey Weinsteins. The idea of enfranchising actors, of giving them a say, rather than pressuring them to just do whatever it takes, strikes me as a very pro-human move, a very pro-human thought, and might in itself actually help to improve all these issues that we've been talking about with both the sexual burden and the overuse of graphic sex scenes in film. A very interesting, radical, and groundbreaking point. More good food for thought. As always, thank you all so much again for all of your excellent discussion points, your nuanced original thoughts, and please feel free to email me with any further ideas that you have about any of these topics. I love it. Also, I should mention, please never be afraid to disagree with me about anything that I say. You're always welcome to disagree and to let me know about it if you want to. I'm learning here too, and the more information I have, the greater the integrity of the thoughts I can think. So once again, thank you for facilitating that process. Now, let's move on to the readings that you did for this week, the Judith Van Evera Behavioral Science Studies and the article Why Should I Go See It by Aaron Ramsey. These two readings, I think, go very well together to illustrate a pretty salient point: the impact of children's media portrayals and the absence thereof on child audiences. Let's start off with a discussion of the Aaron Ramsey article, Why Should I Go See It? I think this article gives a really poignant anecdotal testimony as to the importance of portrayals of female characters, particularly non-sexualized female characters with agency in children's media. Aaron Ramsey describes what I would call a pretty dismal childhood experience of being relegated to playing unimportant female side characters from TV shows and movies predominantly meant for little boys, and her ultimate lack of badass, non-compromised female role models in nearly all of the media she consumed throughout her entire life up until around the age of 30, when she saw the significant, groundbreaking, extremely unfairly maligned Ghostbusters film from 2016. Let's take a look at the masterful bravura sequence from that film that Ramsey refers to as the moment. That is, the moment when Kate McKinnon's character Holtzman saves the world in a dirty, baggy MTA jumpsuit, as Aaron Ramsey puts it, a rare glimpse of a triumphant, completely non-sexualized portrayal of a female hero in modern film history. Let's watch the moment.
Forgot about my new toys. Let's go.
Now, the interesting thing to me personally about Ramsey's discussion when she asks at the end, how would my life have been different if 7-year-old me had seen this scene, or a scene like it? How much more could I have done? How much less would I have struggled? Because I personally happen to be only a couple years separated from Aaron Ramsey in time. I'm just a couple years younger than her, which means that by the time that I was in 2nd grade, my life trajectory had already been set on a much more gender-positive track by a certain very groundbreaking show, which we've already seen some snippets of in this class, called The Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. let's take a look at a clip from Power Rangers, in which I'll ask you to pay special close attention to Trini, the Yellow Ranger, a female tomboy Power Ranger who gets quite the heroic portrayal. Let's take a look.
Jason, look!
Stop! Come on, blast us!
Yeah, all right.
We need to destroy his head. Trini, catch!
Look out! So long, bonehead!
Yeah. What we have here is a profoundly empowering moment that, in a very 1990s children's television way, echoes the moment from Ghostbusters 2016. We have a female character absolutely cutting down a line of 4 enemy henchmen single-handed in a matter of seconds and destroying the villain by throwing its head into a pit of lava, again, pretty much single-handedly. Pretty darn badass. I was, I think, 6 years old when I first saw this. Speaking for myself, I know that this shaped me as a person. It made me believe profoundly in my own personal power, and as you already know, gave me a sense of security and protection against anything scary that I encountered in the real world or other fictional media, like, for example, having accidentally watched the movie Friday the 13th. Oh, man. I grew up to be, the confident person that I am today, to instinctively doubt the veracity of disempowered and sexist female portrayals in all media that I watched after this, in significant part because of how deeply I latched onto and believed in Trini the Yellow Ranger and the powerful female portrayals I saw in Power Rangers early on in my childhood. But there's another layer to this portrayal that I think is very significant and which warrants me bringing up here. All the action footage of the Power Rangers fighting monsters in costume is borrowed from a series of Japanese children's shows called Super Sentai Hero Series. Super Sentai Hero Series! Super Sentai, basically it means task force or elite squadron, but in terms of meaning it's basically just the Japanese word for Power Rangers. These series started in Japan in the 1970s and were brought over to North America in the 90s by Israeli-born television mogul Chaim Saban, who hired a diverse cast of American actors to play the originally all-Japanese heroes when out of costume, dubbing the Japanese voice actors with the English-language cast during the helmeted action scenes. You don't have to worry about lip sync. And the illusion was really effective and, of course, totally fooled me and went over everybody's head as a kid. But the interesting thing that I learned much, much later was that on the Japanese show, there was only one female ranger, and it was the Pink Ranger. That's right, on the Japanese show, my favorite character, Trini the Yellow Ranger, was a boy, whose character, ironically enough, was literally named Boy in the Japanese series. Oh my gosh. I actually did my master's degree thesis on the differences between the original Japanese and American versions of the show, and discovered that the Japanese version, Kyoryu Sentai Juranger, which basically means like Dinosaur Squadron Beast Ranger, was actually pretty sexist against their sole female character, the Pink Ranger, who's treated kind of like a second-class hero, often getting beaten up, needing to be rescued, frequently being shown caring for children while the boys do the fighting. In short, a portrayal completely antithetical to the powerful feminism in the American version of the show. One of the great brilliances of the American show was the decision to gender swap the Yellow Ranger, making a male character who in the Japanese series gets repeated single-handed hero moments into a female character much better suited to the needs of a culture with much less inherent sexism than Japan. Sorry, Japan, you know I love you, but you know it's true. Another interesting phenomenon is the improved appeal that this lends to the portrayal. The same performance, when coded as female, reads so much more impressively, and for me, it's so much more fun to watch than it is when you're thinking of it as a male character. Let's take another look at a great triumphant Yellow Ranger Trini scene in which footage from the Japanese show in which a male ranger is rescuing a woman morphs, if you will, into an outstandingly badass moment in which a young woman comes to the rescue of her friend, heroically taking hits from the powerful villain Goldar to give the Pink Ranger Kimberly her chance to escape. Let's watch.
You're mine!
Yeah, you gotta catch us first. Look out! Hi-ya! Yeah, call the others! Get out, right?
Now, the difference between my own play experience with Power Rangers and Erin Ramsey's rather dismal description of her playground experience when she was younger is kind of illustrative here, I think. At recess, as a first and second grader, I was one of, I think, about 3 Yellow Rangers fighting against evil alongside, as I recall, like 30 Red Rangers, 7 Pink Rangers, 20-some Black Rangers, and like 5 Blue Rangers, illustrating the powerful influence that Power Rangers had on real children's play behaviors, especially in terms of encouraging children of different genders to play together as equals. This is something Erin Ramsey didn't have, and it's because of a difference in children's media between her time and mine, separated by only 2 years, by what was available on TV. I think that Judith Van Everett, that is, would have a field day. This brings me to a discussion of that book, The Wonderful Television and Child Development, one of my all-time favorites and the reading that you did for this week. The Van Ever reading is a compilation of concepts, ideas, summarizations, and conclusions drawn from decades' worth of behavioral science research into the impacts of children's media, with an especial focus on television, on real children's thoughts, beliefs, play behaviors, and other such things. Later chapters of the book discuss other media like video games and the internet, as well as audiences older than children. That's the really interesting stuff, as it reveals how similar the adult audience might actually be to the child audience, despite the common and very wrong presumption that adults are simply never affected by media. But its overall focus, as the title would suggest, is on television and child development. As a side note, in case you were disappointed that the reading selections I gave you didn't give enough information or go into as much detail as you would have liked regarding the exact specifics of the types of experiments conducted, I would be happy to email you any bibliographical information for any of the experiments mentioned in the book that you'd like to know more about. The index has much more information in it. But in the meantime, I'll just note, the form that these experiments usually take. Typically, they're done with multiple groups of children, often of varying ages, races, genders, socioeconomic backgrounds, etc., who will either just be given a survey to fill out or have their parents fill out about their viewing habits, or otherwise will be asked to watch a certain video. Now, this video will usually be either a variable, something with a specific type of message, whether positive or negative, or a control, sometimes a boring neutral video, sometimes just television static, sometimes no video at all, sometimes something else, during and after which children will be observed, with researchers telling things like how interested or engaged children seem to be with the video, how many violent or antisocial play behaviors they engaged in afterwards, what thoughts and perceptions they have about the world before and after viewing, and so on. This is just a rough idea, and the specifics of each experiment are, of course, different and unique to each experiment. But, having once worked as an animator for the children's cartoon company Dog Sharks, and having met with behavioral science researchers who explained what their job was to me and the rest of the team and the sort of things that they do, that's, where I'm getting this information from to sort of fill out the info that's there in the Judith Van Ever reading. So, back in the day was when I was an unpaid animation intern. So anyway, the overall takeaway I hope you got from the Judith Van Ever reading is that different kinds of media consumption have different effects on different people. This is a complicated field of study. There's no easy one-size-fits-all answer. And as researchers Schramm, Lyle, and Parker have put it, The chief part television plays in the lives of children depends at least as much on what a child brings to television as on what television brings to a child. Differences in things like home life, socioeconomic status, monitored versus unmonitored TV viewing, the child's own natural preferences, their likes and dislikes, their intelligence level, and the influence of other factors in their lives that may either contradict or support perceptions gained from television viewing are all factors in determining what impact television will have on any given individual child. And of course, we can presume that the same is true for other media besides television. It's not a magic bullet, as early media theorists and reformers once believed, that affects every viewer in exactly the same way, nor is television mind control, nor, on the other hand, does it exist in a vacuum without having any effects on people. Of course it affects people, and the specific types of effects media will have on viewers varies considerably, depending on who those individual viewers are, how much they watch, how consistent their viewing habits are, and various other factors. Interestingly, this isn't just limited to the categories that they belong to. Individual values matter a lot. For example, I once interviewed two little girls who were sisters, same race, same socioeconomic status, living in the same house with the same parents in the same town and all of that, about their video and media viewing habits, say that 3 times fast, and preferences. One of them was bouncing off the walls the whole interview long, excited and rattling off all the cartoons and kids shows that she watched and loved. The other was lukewarm, more into books, barely even watched television, and what few shows she did watch were totally different from what her sister preferred. So given that, I think it's fairly safe to say that individual preferences and personality may be of the most significant factors to consider when looking at these research studies, and that it's important to keep in mind that all viewers are individuals who will bring different thoughts and experiences to the table. In other words, to return to the language of cinema studies and more recent scholarship surrounding gaze theory, people each have their own unique perspectives and hence our own unique cinematic gazes. This is basically just another way to phrase the same concept that behavioral science media research came up with independently, describing the same idea with more scientific sounding language. Basically, in short, our two fields agree about this concept. Another crucial takeaway from the Van Everen reading is that television's messages, and hence its potential effects on viewers, can either be antisocial or pro-social. That's right! Pro-social. A vocabulary term. Pro-social behavior is basically the polar opposite of antisocial behavior. It's defined as a social behavior that demonstrates an intent to benefit others or society as a whole, behaviors such as helping, sharing, donating, cooperating, and volunteering. Obeying the rules and conforming to socially acceptable behaviors are also regarded as pro-social behaviors. That was quoted and paraphrased in part from Wikipedia. So, for example, ironically enough, right now, staying home and social distancing, wearing masks, washing your hands, keeping 6 feet away from other people when you go outside, these are technically all examples of pro-social behavior in our current environment, given our current circumstances. In terms of children's television, examples of pro-social behavior modeled for kids might include He-Man's respectful treatment of Teela, or the teamwork and cooperation that we just saw when Billy the Blue Ranger throws Trini the villain's head, passing it like a football player who trusts his teammate, and sending the message that a female character is an equal and a valuable member of the superhero team. Some of the most pro-social TV programs are the ones meant for very young children, and perhaps the single most pro-social children's program ever to be created may well have been the much-acclaimed Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, the only program, as far as I am aware, and I've researched this pretty thoroughly, the only program to have ever scored higher even than Sesame Street in terms of pro-social influence on children, which is a significantly crazy high watermark. It is also, as far as I know, the only known television program ever proven to actually increase rather than decrease children's attention spans, a remarkable feat to say the least. Rather than show you a clip from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood itself, I'm going to show you something I think a little more adult, but absolutely no less pro-social or heartwarming. Here is the description found under the YouTube video from whence I took the upcoming clip. On May 1st, 1969, Fred Rogers, host of the then recently nationally syndicated children's television series Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, testified before the Senate Committee on Commerce's Subcommittee on Communications to defend $20 million in federal funding proposed for the newly formed nonprofit Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which was at risk of being reduced to $10 million. So, half its budget was going to be cut. Subcommittee Chairman Senator John Pastore, Democrat of Rhode Island, unfamiliar with Fred Rogers, is initially abrasive toward him. Over the course of Rogers' 6-minute testimony, Pastore's demeanor gradually transitions to one of awe and admiration as Rogers speaks. Let's take a look.
All right, Rogers, you got the floor.
Senator Pastore, this is a philosophical statement and would take about 10 minutes to read, so I'll not do that. One of the first things that a child learns in a healthy family is trust, and I trust what you have said that you will read this. It's very important to me. I care deeply about children. My first children...
Will it make you happy if you read it?
I'd just like to talk about it, if it's all right.
Sir. Okay.
My first children's program was on WQED 15 years ago, and its budget was $30. Now, with the help of the Sears Roebuck Foundation and National Educational Television, as well as all of the affiliated stations, each station pays to show our program. It's a unique kind of funding in educational television. With this help, now our program has a budget of $6,000. It may sound like quite a difference, but $6,000 pays for less than 2 minutes of cartoons, 2 minutes of animated, what I sometimes say, bombardment. I'm very much concerned, as I know you are, about what's being delivered to our children in this country. And I've worked in the field of child development for 6 years now, trying to understand the inner needs of children. We deal with such things as the inner drama of childhood. We don't have to bop somebody over the head to make him to make drama on the screen. We deal with such things as getting a haircut, or the feelings about brothers and sisters, and the kind of anger that arises in simple family situations. And we speak to it constructively.
How long a program is it?
It's a half hour every day. Most channels schedule it in the noontime as well as in the evening. WETA here has scheduled it in the late afternoon.
Could we get a copy of this so that we can see it? Maybe not today, but I'd like to see the program.
I'd like very much for you
I'd
to
like to see the program itself, or any one of them, you see.
We made 100 programs for EEN, the Eastern Educational Network, and then when the money ran out, people in Boston and Pittsburgh and Chicago all came to the fore and said, we've got to have more of this neighborhood expression of care. And this is what I give. I give an expression of care every day to each child to help him realize that he is unique. I end the program by saying, you've made this day a special day by just your being you. There's no person in the whole world like you, and I like you just the way you are. And I feel that if we in public television can only make it clear that feelings are mentionable and manageable, we will have done a great service for mental health. Uh, I think that it's much more dramatic that two men could be working out their feelings of anger. Much more dramatic than showing something of gunfire. I'm constantly concerned about what our children are seeing. And for 15 years, I have tried in this country and Canada to present what I feel is a meaningful expression of care.
Do you narrate it?
I'm the host, yes, and I do all the puppets, and I write all the music, and I write all the scripts.
Well, I'm supposed to be a pretty tough guy, and this is the first time I've had goosebumps for the last 2 days.
Well, I'm grateful not only for your goosebumps, but for your interest in our kind of communication. Could I tell you the words of one of the songs which I feel is very important?
Yes.
This has to do with that good feeling of control, which I feel that children need to know is there. And it starts out, what do you do with the mad that you feel? And that first line came straight from a child. I work with children, doing puppets in very personal communication with small groups. What do you do with the mad that you feel? When you feel so mad you could bite. When the whole wide world seems oh so wrong, and nothing you do seems very right. What do you do? Do you punch a bag? Do you pound some clay or some dough? Do you round up friends for a game of tag or see how fast you go? It's great to be able to stop when you've planned a thing that's wrong and be able to do something else instead and think this song. I can stop when I want to, can stop when I wish, can stop, stop, stop anytime. And what a good feeling to feel like this and know that the feeling is really mine. Know that there's something deep inside that helps us become what we can. For a girl can be someday a lady, and a boy can be someday a man.
I think it's wonderful. I think it's wonderful. Looks like you just earned the $20 million.
Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood aired nationally from February 19th, 1968 to August 31st, 2001, spanning decades of time and giving generations of children positive pro-social messages about pretty much everything under the sun. I often say that Mr. Rogers would make a great introduction for aliens to the concept of life on Earth. It's really just a very patient, slow explanation of things like what a telephone is and what a menu is and just how life works, and it's a beautiful thing. Fred Rogers himself was recently the subject of the acclaimed 2018 documentary Won't You Be My Neighbor, and the even more recent biopic A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood from last year starring Tom Hanks. The Judith Van Evera reading highlights Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood as a particularly good example of a show that models pro-social behavior and sends positive, educational, and emotionally healthful messages to children, and did so consistently throughout the show's entire decades-long run. But an important thing to point out here about the Van Evera reading is that the very idea of behavioral science research studying what real quantifiable impacts and influences media has on various groups of viewers of any age, let alone specifically children, is a fairly new concept that really doesn't emerge prior to the advent of television. Although the notion of media's effects on children may have always been thought about, commented on, and discussed by reformers and concerned critics, it was all mostly based on unscientific hearsay, assumptions, and speculation rather than hard science, the kind that we can rely upon today in order to develop children's media. Which brings me to a discussion of the overall history of American children's media, beginning with, you guessed it, the silent era. We're starting at the very beginning. You know, it's me. Early children's media of the silent era, honestly, for pretty much most of film history, even after then, until the advent of television, was composed largely of short subject material. These ranged from kiddie show shorts, often derived from vaudeville sketches, like the work of silent-era child actress Baby Peggy, the last living silent film star who only just passed away this February at the venerable old age of 101. Praise to Baby Peggy. To silent cartoons like Felix the Cat and Fleischer Studios' Coco the Clown. In terms of feature films, Tom Mix seems to be largely creditable with bringing the concept of the cowboy western into the public understanding as a children's genre, particularly films meant for male children. Of course, male children. Yeah, that's going to be big, so yeah, just keep watching. This brings up an interesting point. For most of the 20th century, I would even say from the dawn of film up until around the 1980s, so nearly a full 100 years, the child audience was largely presumed either male or gender neutral, but generally not female. Very little, if any, thought whatsoever seems to have been put into the notion of making films or other media specifically for little girls. There were films for adult women and adult men, films for little boys, and gender-neutral children. But the number one age and gender demographic most overlooked by the vast majority of Hollywood history seems to have been the female child audience. It makes sense, honestly, in terms of what you might expect from a society that values men over women and adults over children. The category of person with the least socio-political power, and therefore presumably the least economic pull, would have been female children. Leaving the silent era and venturing into the 1930s, even in, cases of children's films and shorts with female protagonists, like Snow White and The Wizard of Oz, even then, the presumed target audience was still not necessarily female children. In these particular cases, as was common practice in the day, the main target audience wasn't even necessarily the child audience so much as it was the general audience, as we've discussed in previous class meetings, the most lucrative audience composed of both adults and children alike. This phenomenon can be seen especially clearly through a lot of moments in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs that have been scaring the pants off of little kids since 1937. This phenomenon suggests that maybe little kids aren't really the only presumed target audience here, as there's plenty of stuff in this film that seems a bit rough for a very young child audience. This is to say nothing of The Wizard of Oz, a fanciful musical comedy with its fair share of spook, tongue-in-cheek humor, and a star-studded cast, the kinds of things meant to appeal to adults. In general, throughout the era of classical Hollywood cinema, whenever media was created supposedly for a child audience, it is generally very careful to pander at least in some part to adults, if not mainly to them, with, I think, cartoons like Looney Tunes, Popeye, and Betty Boop perhaps revealing this phenomenon the most explicitly. So, to a certain degree, motion picture media meant exclusively for children arguably didn't technically exist yet at this time. There were films and shorts meant to appeal largely to children, but these usually do attempt to appeal at least to some degree, if not mainly, to adults as well. Remember, in a pre-rating system Hollywood, it was all about mass appeal to all ages, the general audience, all the butts and all the seats to make the most money. Aside from a sparse sprinkling of Disney features, it's not really until the 1950s, with the advent of television and the idea of motion picture media specifically targeted toward a child audience, that the child audience really becomes a mainstream concept. Children always had child-specific, non-filmic entertainment, whether these were, comic books, children's golden books, or whatever picture books you might have, radio programs like Little Orphan Annie and The Adventures of Superman, as they say on The Adventures of Superman, meant specifically for kids. But the idea of feature films or even shorts intended exclusively for a child audience is a relatively later concept that doesn't fully emerge into the mainstream until the advent of television and its popularization throughout the 1950s. But what I think it's important to understand is that even in Disney movies prior to the advent of television, we see a noticeably heavier focus on the gender-neutral and male child audience than on the little girl audience. For one thing, there was actually only one single Disney princess whose film came out prior to the advent of television, Snow White. And that's it. The second Disney princess, Cinderella, doesn't come around until 1950, over 2 years after the commercial availability of television to the average American consumer. I think it's important to point out that prior to the advent of television, Disney had made only one feature film with a female protagonist, Snow White, while it had made 4 feature animated films starring male protagonists, Pinocchio, Dumbo, Bambi, and Song of the South. That's 4 times as many. I think this solidly illustrates how sparse the landscape of motion picture media for little girls was in a pre-television world. Not even Disney, a company that is now famous for its princess protagonists, had made more than one feature film of this type yet. Chew on that for a second. Now, while princesses like Snow White and Cinderella are themselves rather rare examples of female protagonists and female representation in children's film from the classical Hollywood era, their happy endings still come out of being rescued from abusive family situations via marriage with rich and powerful men. What is this, everyone? Oh, that's right! Compromised feminism, you got it. It's feministic in that the princesses are our sympathetic protagonists. They're overall given a very positive character portrayal, but it's compromised that they tend to be a bit passive, unable to take much action for themselves, requiring help, often supernatural help from others, and of course being rescued through marriage with a man in order to get their happy endings, hence compromised feminism. So this all begins to gradually change as a result of the 1950s television boom. Unlike film, which charges an upfront ticket price and courts a general audience in order to make the greatest profit, television's business model is entirely different. TV audiences are not captive. They don't pay an upfront ticket price, and they are able to change the channel at any moment, whenever they want, for free. As such, television makes its money through corporate sponsorship, funding stations through paid commercial advertisements, and courting niche demographics rather than the general audience. That's right. Niche demographics. Niche demographics are basically the opposite of a general audience. It's a very narrow, focused group of people with a specific common interest, often shared because of belonging to the same subgroup, like, gender, age, culture, race, socioeconomic status, etc. This is how television's business model works. You have a show that appeals to a certain niche demographic. Let's take, for example, Housewives. Thanks to the PR research and manipulative marketing techniques popularized in the 50s by Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays, who we talked about before, television networks understood that a demographic like 1950s Housewives was likely to fill the daytime hours with television use, often having it on in the background while they did their chores. So during the daytime hours, shows meant to appeal to housewives, usually low budget, like romance dramas, would be played on TV, accompanied by advertisements for the types of products that housewives would be likely to use. For example, soap to clean their houses and do the chores that they were doing. This is quite literally where we get the term soap opera, illustrating how the type of program produced is in reality very much tied to the sponsorship of companies whose commercials run during the breaks, even if people today very seldom realize this. It is television's focus on niche demographics that first begins to create a logical space for media meant to appeal exclusively to children to occupy. Shows like Howdy Doody, The Mickey Mouse Club, and Captain Video and his Video Rangers were some of the most successful early examples of children's television programming truly meant specifically and exclusively for a child audience. This is of course without attempting to also court an adult audience in the margins. And again, as you might expect, these shows too were of course generally intended for a male-leaning child audience. All the main characters on Howdy Doody and Captain Video were male. They took place in the male-coded cowboy and sci-fi genres, and though there were some female characters on the Mickey Mouse Club, they appeared more as a part of a performing ensemble troupe than as individuals with highlighted roles. But perhaps the real thing that put the child audience seriously on the map, the thing that expanded it from a flash in the pan in early television in the 1950s into a worldwide phenomenon that has continued on and only grown and gotten stronger, that is, ever since, is a new understanding of the purchasing power of the child audience. Now, exactly how this happened is a very interesting story, but prior to the era of early television, tie-in toy branding basically wasn't a thing. There were a few rare examples, but they were, sparse, clumsy, and hardly ever done. A couple of easy go-to examples are the Wizard of Oz soap figurines and the rather unattractive early attempts at Mickey Mouse plush toys. Can you imagine a movie like The Wizard of Oz coming out today and the only product tie-in that, was sold to stores were sculpted pieces of soap, which, by the way, do not even include Dorothy, the main character? Like, who is this for, I wonder? Like, is this for kids? Or is this for, like, maybe, the parents? Or, like, the mom? Like, I don't know. It's a pretty weird item to market. I'm not really sure who it's for. Now, it just so happens that I happen to have a sort of insider scoop on the story of how the concept of modern toy tie-in branding as we know it was established. Lido Toys, one of the earliest, if not the earliest toy companies to start offering licensed television character branded toys, was a toy company specializing in plastics owned by Effie Ehrenstein, who just so happens to be my Aunt Lois's father. Lido Toys was actually really groundbreaking in terms of understanding the marketing potential of television show tie-ins, the purchasing power of the child audience, and the influence that television media consumption had on shaping what products and what merchandise would be desirable to children and therefore saleable to parents. The story goes that Effie Ehrenstein was sitting at a pub in Germany looking at a collection of Toby mugs with sculpted faces on them. Toby mugs and also tobacco pipes with faces sculpted on them are a traditional thing in parts of Europe, including Germany, and Effie Ehrenstein had the thought that, wait a minute, we're making generic blank plastic bubble pipes in our toy factory. But what if instead we made bubble pipes with faces on them, like the faces of famous children's characters like Howdy Doody and Mickey Mouse? It was a hit. It changed the landscape of children's media and marketing forever. Lido Toys was really on the cusp of a highly savvy understanding of television's marketing capability in a way that was not only ahead of its time, but which would help shape the model of television show creation and ultimately help to establish the child audience as a legitimate, respectable target demographic for serious mainstream filmic and television media development on into the future. The fact that the child audience lacks inhibitions. It's not their money being spent. They have nothing to lose and everything to gain from pressuring their parents to buy them toys. They hold a persuasive pull on parents who control the money. Everybody likes to make their kids happy. And children are relatively more easily influenced by media advertising relative to adults, as we learned from Judith Van Evera. Another interesting thing revealed by Lido Toys' branding efforts is that they were often barely relevant to the TV shows whose recognition factors they were trading on. What does a bubble pipe have to do with Mickey Mouse? Who cares? Kids would see Mickey Mouse's face. Think of it, associate it with the Mickey Mouse Club show and other beloved Disney characters and shorts and features that they enjoyed, and that would be enough. Of particular irrelevance is Lido's Captain Video toy line, composed of a charming array of spacemen, robots, aliens, and vehicles, none of which ever appeared on the Captain Video television show. It's all about packaging. It's about branding. You see a picture of Captain Video on the box, and you get excited. You understand, that's what this is! This is Captain Video! Even if the thing inside the the box does not remotely resemble anything that ever appeared on the show, it gives kids the opportunity to psychically take a little piece of their beloved TV show with them, to hold it in their hand and keep it in their pocket, and to associate it with the positive feelings that they have about watching their television program, and marry those positive associations into a cherished physical treasure object, the possession of which brings a child joy. It doesn't matter that the object itself has, in reality, no true connection to the TV show that the child watches. That's the magic of branding, and also the magic of the human imagination. So after the 50s had firmly established the child audience's mainstream legitimacy through its purchasing power, there was an effort to capitalize on the child audience via animated cartoons, often extremely low-budget cartoons, like Clutch Cargo, which utilizes a technique called synchrovox, which is a polite word for not animating.
Ooga looga, Clutch Cargo.
Ooga looga to you, Snowshoe. Come on in. Spinner, I want you to meet Snowshoe Slednick and his dog Snowball. You've heard me speak of them.
Yeah, I've always wanted to meet you, Mr. Snowshoe. Do you really have days and nights that are 6 months long, Mr. Snowshoe?
Basically, the idea was to make the most money, with the least expense. The 1960s saw further capitalization on the child's demographic through cartoons, especially on the part of the Hanna-Barbera company, via continued efforts to create animations that targeted children as their main demographic. Still, these cartoons were largely for a gender-neutral audience that leaned male, as can be seen through their consistent focus on male protagonists, with occasional female side but not main characters. Let's take a look at a quick sample of some Hanna-Barbera cartoons to illustrate this point. as you can see from that sampling, we have some earlier Hanna-Barbera series like The Jetsons and The Flintstones, built off the model of 1950s television nuclear family sitcom programs, with The Flintstones being a direct parody of the 1955 live-action show The Honeymooners, and focusing, as can be easily seen even just through their theme songs, on the male patriarch of each family as the main protagonist, with female side characters, most of whom are depicted as housewives, both in the ancient past and the distant future. We see through the original Space Ghost, not to be confused with the 1994 to 2008 parody show Space Ghost Coast to Coast, but the original serious superhero show, an early typical entry in the genre of children's superhero cartoons, again with an obvious male focus and appeal to a male child audience. 1969's Scooby-Doo does the best job among these examples as far as female representation goes, I think. But again, as with the Mickey Mouse Club, Daphne and Velma are members of an ensemble cast and not the main focus, who I would argue is technically the dog Scooby-Doo, maybe Scrappy, but mostly Scooby-Doo. In addition to animation, there were also live-action shows for kids, especially the superhero shows that spanned the 50s through the 70s, with Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, all of which had a certain degree of cross-appeal to adults, particularly Batman for its comedic and absurdist parody aspects that flew over little kids' heads, but were famously enjoyed by adults, and particularly college students who got the subtle humor and really dug it, and Wonder Woman for all of Linda Carter's tame but obvious sex appeal to the male gaze. In addition to superheroes, there were plenty of other costumed non-superheroes, usually in the Western genre, and especially prevalent throughout the 1950s, like Disney's 1957 Zorro series, the long-spanning Lone Ranger series that started in 1949 and didn't end until 1957, which for early television and particularly children's shows is super long. Wyatt Earp, 1955 to 61, The Roy Rogers Show, The Gene Autry Show, Zane Grey Theater, and so many others. The 50s had a lot of westerns. These shows were often excellent, well-written, heavily pro-social, and even occasionally rather progressive children's entertainment, especially as it concerns the treatment of the character Tonto in the Lone Ranger series, played by Jay Silverheels, which not only gave extremely rare representation of a non-white main character played by a real Native American in the 1950s too, but was also used to promote frequent anti-racist messages to children throughout the series' run. A great, very valuable thing from the 1950s, to say the least. In spite of this, however, these shows still demonstrate the heavy focus on the male child audience to the neglect of the preferences of female children. So Hanna-Barbera's cartoon success continues on throughout the 60s and 70s with hits like Scooby-Doo, as we saw, and later The Super Friends, another ensemble cast superhero show with a couple of female characters in the majority male group. In this catalog of Hanna-Barbera cartoons was Josie and the Pussycats, a series that aired between 1970 and 1971, and which seems to have been perhaps the first television show, and maybe even the first piece of motion picture media itself, ever meant to specifically target the female child audience. Let's take a look at Josie and the Pussycats right now.
Josie and the Pussycats, long tails and ears for hands, guitars and sharps and flats, neat, sweet, a groovy song, you're invited, come along. Hurry, hurry, see all the pleasure, or maybe friends, we could be a ninja or perchance, be with us in Bangkok, makes no difference everywhere the action's at.
saw there was a classic example of a cartoon show spending much more money and effort on its intro than would actually, be seen throughout the show itself, a common practice in animation even to this day. Now, some interesting things reveal themselves about this show. First, it's based on characters and scenarios that originally appeared in Archie comic books throughout the 1960s. Comics meant largely for a female tween audience, perhaps revealing the idea behind this cartoon being to court the female child audience that was theoretically already following the Archie comics. It stands to reason that if you can sell them comics, then you should be able to sell them the animated series, and vice versa. Girls who started watching the cartoon show on TV might then be expected to start purchasing the comics in their daily lives. Revealingly, like many women's pictures, Josie and the Pussycats also has an all-female group protagonist, and rather progressively, one of them is black. While the portrayal seems pretty groundbreaking and empowering on paper, after all, it does seem to be the first nationally broadcast TV show to court a female child audience, Josie and the Pussycats nevertheless comes off as a piece of compromised feminism when looked at through 2020 vision, and not just because of the cat suits. Let's take a look at a couple more clips to help illustrate what I mean.
If I can pick this lock with my fingernail file, we can climb back up to the dirigible. Don't be such a slowpoke, Valerie. Let me do it. Hey! Grab it! Never mind her. Please continue, sir. That's all right, Princess. We'll get out of this mess yet. But how? Like in the movies. Some brave and daring heroes will ride out of the night and rescue us.
So throughout the 50s through the 70s, and even beyond to today, the one constant in the appeal to the child audience was, of course, the ongoing business of tie-in branding, whether in the form of toys, cereal box mascots, comic books, or other ancillary media that people, or specifically kids who are watching these cartoons and other kids shows might want to buy. So the question raises itself. If Josie and the Pussycats was the only thing out there specifically made for little girls at this time, how did we get from there to where we are today? Why the sudden focus on the little girl demographic as opposed to the gender-neutral or presumed male child audience? Why the sudden differentiation of genders within the child audience? What happened? What changed? Well, this brings us to a discussion of the 1980s and a return to the series He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. But before I go any further, your assignment for tonight is this. Take an example of children's media from your own childhood, could be a TV show or a movie, anything is fair game, and think about whether it is intended for a male child audience, a female child audience, or a gender-neutral child audience. Then answer the following questions. Number 1, how do you know? Like, what makes you suspect it's for what gender? Number 2, was there a toy line, and if there was, did you have any toys from the line? And number 3, of all the children's media we have discussed or will discuss later tonight, what does it seem the most similar to and why? More to follow on how to submit it, and now back to He-Man. So He-Man was a toy line first, actually, before it was ever a cartoon series. The cartoon was created later to help boost toy sales, a strategy that was highly successful. For more details on this, I refer you to the wonderful episode that covers this on Netflix's The Toys That Made Us. He-Man actually ends up as the founder of what would later come to be called the half-hour toy commercial. Basically, the half-hour toy commercial is what kids' cartoons in the 80s became. After the wild success of He-Man's toy line resulting from the popularity of the cartoon series, a huge number of new toy lines and accompanying cartoon series popped up to cash in the 80s. All of a sudden, toy companies were funding new animated cartoon series themselves solely to sell their toy lines. This was a groundbreaking new idea. This branding concept in the 80s seems in truth to be the main reason why the female child audience was ever considered in its own right as a legitimate target demographic. An early example of this, of course, includes Mattel's sister toy line accompanying the He-Man series, She-Ra and the Princesses of Power, made to capitalize off of the surprisingly large female child audience that was already watching He-Man. Let's take a look at She-Ra in both her cartoon and toy commercial incarnations.
I am Adora, He-Man's twin sister and defender of the Crystal Castle. This is Spirit, my beloved steed. Fabulous secrets were revealed to me the day I held aloft my sword and said, "For the honor of Grayskull!" I am She-Ra! Only a few others share this secret. Among them are Light Hope, Madame Raz, and Cowl. Together, we and my friends of the Great Rebellion strive to free Etheria from the evil forces of Hordak!
This is Princess Adora, sister of He-Man, and her gentle horse. Each sold separately, you can pretend.
She's lovely as a flower, but she has a secret power. The magic sword in one stroke, and she's got the strength of a tower. She-Ra, Princess of Power.
And now, a She-Ra necklace for you to wear. Wow. Free in specially marked packages while supplies last. She-Ra doll Princess of Power comes with everything you see here. From Mattel.
I want you to take a moment to understand the significance of what we're talking about here. It would seem rather as though the only reason why the female child audience was ever considered in its own right as a legitimate target demographic has to do with the fact that the types of toys traditionally marketed to little girls differ in our culture from the types of toys traditionally marketed to little boys. Girls play with dolls, boys play with action figures. Another word for dolls. And because of the power of the patriarchal gender binary present in our society, and especially strong in the 1980s, aisles in toy stores were then, as they are now, divided by gender. This, incidentally, is in part why video game consoles, a truly gender-neutral electronic toy that focus groups had already known as early as the 1980s, were played equally by both genders, why video games are seen today as male-coded or for boys. Game companies realized in the 1980s that putting consoles in the girls' toy aisle would scare boys away from purchasing console units, whereas putting them in the boys' aisle wouldn't scare girls off in the same way, a result of who holds power in a patriarchal society and the fear that a boy buying a girl's toy would somehow be feminizing and hence disempowering, whereas a girl buying a boy's toy is perhaps masculizing and therefore empowering. It's all nonsense. Gender is a spectrum. Anyway, this idea basically opened the floodgates in the 1980s to a whole bunch of toy lines and cartoon series meant to specifically target little girls, many of which were hugely successful to the point of still being around to this day. Even before She-Ra hit screens and shelves, we actually have similar branding concepts emerging from the world of greeting cards, like Strawberry Shortcake, whose cartoon show ran 1980 to 1985, Care Bears, 1985 to 1988, and Rainbow Bright, 84 to 86, all of which eventually developed their own, cartoon shows, starting out with specials and then becoming series, and related toy lines meant to target little girls. Of particular interest, I think, are a couple of series. The first is Gem and the Holograms from 1985 to 88, and My Little Pony, 86 to 87. Like Josie and the Pussycats, Gem and the Holograms also follows a female rock band that composes, again, the female group protagonist of this series, which again contains one token black member. At this point, you may notice the female group protagonist begins to serve a dual function in 1980s media, simultaneously representing the real lived experience of female children negotiating friendships among a large group of differentiated female friends, reflecting and appealing to the relatively high rates of social intelligence among female children, and also selling more toys. Now, unlike the recent 2015 feature film of the same name, Gem and the Holograms, the original cartoon show, is actually a high-octane action-adventure series starring a Batman-like orphaned female millionaire, Jerrica Benson, whose secret identity of the incognito, pink-haired mystery rock star Gem is achieved through a series of high-tech hologram projections linked between a secret supercomputer in her Batcave-like mansion base and remote-controlled by her signature hot pink earrings. Let's take a look at a couple of clips from Gem and the Holograms right now.
Do you understand what to do?
Yes, Jerrica. I understand. I am ready to protect the holograms.
Showtime, Synergy.
About to end.
Thanks, Synergy. Hurry up! It's okay, Rio. I just dropped my earring.
So, as you can see, this series was, as the theme song says, truly outrageous, incorporating extremely high levels of female agency, cool uses of high-tech hologram projections by the female protagonist, and attempts to interest the little girl audience with appeals to concepts like fashion and fame. There's even an ongoing, rather stormy romance plot with the purple-haired male character Rio, who incidentally behaves in a really ridiculous way. He's hot and cold, extremely emotional, oversensitive, and just behaves ridiculously in a way that seems both absurd and also very much in line with what you might imagine a female child thinks a teenage boy is like. I find Rio very unintentionally funny. Overall, Gem is a great show, even if it does use traditionally masculine action-adventure storyline tropes like many other girls' cartoons from the 80s, rather than appeals to the female intelligence, which we will talk about later, using emotional and problem-solving techniques about, interpersonal relationships rather than action and violence. But Jem, nonetheless, still models awesome agency and very appealing female role models to little girls. Now, to further illustrate these ideas, I want to go back to the other series that I had mentioned, the original My Little Pony cartoon. Let's take a look.
You go, a smiling face, running and skipping, watching the morning unfold. My little pony, what does the future hold? Starring Sandy Duncan and Tony Randall.
Look out, Twilight! Here I go! Now it's my turn! Oh, I could have made it. I wish. I'm one with a double inside-out flute. But it's dangerous, Firefly. Danger is my life, Medley. Firefly, look out! Applesauce, anyone?
Sunny and pleasant, death of the present. No sign of trouble inside. My little pony, my little pony. May all your days be bright. May all your days be bright.
Twilight, will I ever fly like Firefly and Medley?
No, Ember. Not all little ponies can fly.
Will I jump far like Bowtie? Or disappear like you can?
Ember, you'll grow up to be your own special little pony.
Oh, everybody, quick! Come on! You're waiting! What's going on? It's the Stratodons! Stratodons!
Seize them! You are all doomed! Soon every pony will belong to T-Rack, the master of Midnight Castle!
Silence! That's better. Guards, remove the small one.
You won't hurt Ember.
She is too small to pull my chariot of midnight, as you should have known, Scorpan.
Well,
But you three will do, for now. Behold the power of darkness!
what's happened to my friends?
They belong to me now. And Scorpan, if by midnight I do not have a fourth pony, a head will roll. His.
Get back inside!
Rainbow of darkness that darkness sends, now begin the night that never ends.
Found your Firefly. Take it to Dream Castle.
Stop her! The game is over, little ponies. The power is mine!
We have a power of our own, Tirak. Take this. It's not doing anything. Maybe the Moo Chick was wrong.
Behold the power of darkness!
Our rainbow! Let's go! We're finished! Our rainbow's fighting back!
It can't be.
Scorpion! What's happening?
He's really a prince.
Tirak turned me into Scorpan when he took over my kingdom.
Aren't you gonna change back to what you were?
Not me. I've always been a baby dragon.
So what you saw there were a couple of clips from the original My Little Pony television special, 1984's Escape from Midnight Castle, also known as Firefly's Adventure. It contains what is perhaps one of the most abrupt tonal shifts I have ever encountered in all of my studies of media history, starting out with scenes of rainbow unicorns and Pegasi frolicking in the meadow, only to have the sky suddenly darken with an army of dragons that kidnap the ponies to be transformed into hell beasts by the evil magic of the centaur demon Tirak. That's a bit of a twist there, isn't it? Now, the really interesting thing about My Little Pony to me is the difference between the commercials for the toy line and the series itself. Let's take a look.
My little pony, my little pony.
I comb and brush her hair.
My little pony, my little pony.
Tie a ribbon to show how much I care.
My little pony, my little pony.
I take her wherever I go.
My little pony, my little pony.
Oh, I love her so. I love you, my little pony.
My Little Pony, each sold separately. Collect them all.
So that was the original My Little Pony toy commercial, and it's similar to all the other commercials for the toy line that came after it in that it stresses what they call grooming play as the main way that little girls were expected to interact and play with these toys, to comb their hair, stroke their forelocks, kiss and cuddle them, and so on. But what's interesting to me is that I myself and every little girl that I ever knew throughout my entire childhood who had and played with My Little Ponies played games with them that were a heck of a lot more badass and much more like the elements of the TV show that you just saw. The ponies in our games would have to fight monsters, escape from capture, use their various powers to beat the villains, and ultimately slay evil and save the day in a very action-oriented manner. Interestingly, in the, I think, much less well done My Little Pony episode of the Toys That Made Us documentary series, there are a couple of bad edits that actually attempt to downplay the very significant fact that the adult female toy collectors interviewed for the show all seem to be reporting similar action-oriented play styles to what I have just described, and not grooming behavior, as toy executives seem to have wrongly presumed was the major appeal of the toy line for little girls. Even Lauren Faust, the, one-time My Little Pony fan turned show creator for the more recent reboot series My Little Pony Friendship is Magic from 2010, even Lauren Faust begins in this episode to describe her own action-oriented play styles inspired by the monster-fighting My Little Pony TV series content, and is quickly cross-dissolved over, cutting her off and censoring out this aspect of her discussion. I find this odd, of course, and actually had reached out to the showrunners of The Toys That Made Us about this issue when this episode first aired. They were apologetic about it, but didn't really offer an explanation as to, what the thought process had been here. Needless to say, on the surface, it appears to me just like bad scholarship, honestly, that attempted to tell its story through cherry-picking facts and ignoring testimony to the contrary of its, grooming play argument. I suspect likely this was a decision either made by a man or possibly a woman who simply never played with My Little Ponies in the 80s, but either way, not a logical choice. Now, this talk of Lauren Faust and, action-oriented play behavior leads me to a discussion of her creation, My Little Pony Friendship is Magic. Let's take a look.
My little pony, my little pony. I used to wonder what friendship could be. Until you all shared its magic with me. Big adventure, tons of fun. A beautiful heart, faithful and strong. Sharing kindness, it's an easy feat. And magic makes it all complete. You have mine. Do you know you're all my very best friends?
Now, perhaps the most significant thing about My Little Pony Friendship is Magic is that it happens to be the first ever children's television show that was developed with the deliberate intention of focusing on the female child brain's well-documented propensity towards complex social engagement and interpersonal problem-solving, rather than the male child brain's well-known propensity toward problem-solving through action and violence. This was the first time that a show for girls was designed for girls in a way that considered the way that the majority of female children are hardwired to think. This was the first children's cartoon show to promote problem-solving strategies and interpersonal, emotional, friendship-oriented conflict resolution rather than violence and action to solve problems. It's particularly poignant, I think, to go back and look at all the previous examples of shows for little girls that we've covered in this episode so far, and realize that all of them use the male child-oriented strategies of violence and action to solve problems. Even the original My Little Pony series, all of these girl shows are using boy problem-solving techniques rather than appealing to the female child's instinctive inclination to solve problems through talking, listening, shared narrative construction, perspective sharing, and a highly adept propensity for negotiating complex interpersonal dynamics between groups of friends with highly differentiated personalities. The fact that previous shows for little girls fail so consistently to do this reveals to me the idea that many of these shows were largely constructed by male creators, or at least had a largely male production perspective, as this was, of course, the default, and to a certain degree, unfortunately, still is, as we've discussed in both the children's television production industry as well as elsewhere in Hollywood film. It is actually thanks to things like the kinds of behavioral science research chronicled by Judith Van Evera that Lauren Faust and her team were able to develop a show for little girls that relied on science to make the show the most relevant, healthy, and pro-social it could be for little girls in terms of promoting emotional problem-solving and interpersonal dynamics. But how do you even go about doing that, right? How do you even make a show where the characters solve conflict through emotional understanding rather than action and violence? Can you even conceive of how that could be done without being talk-heavy and really boring? The fact that it's actually really hard to imagine illustrates two things to me. Number one, how little this kind of narrative there is out there in our existing media, how little anyone has tried to do this. And number two, how amazingly well Lauren Faust and her team knock it out of the park. Let's take a look.
You little fool! Thinking you could defeat me! Now you will never see your princess or your son. The night will last forever!
Don't worry, we'll be there.
You think
you can destroy the elements of harmony just like that? Well, you're wrong, because the spirits of the elements of harmony are right here!
What?
Applejack, who reassured me when I was in doubt, represents the spirit of honesty. Fluttershy, who tamed the manticore with her compassion, represents the spirit of kindness. Pinkie Pie, who banished fear by giggling in the face of danger, represents the spirit of laughter. Rarity, who calmed a sorrowful serpent with a meaningful gift, represents the spirit of generosity. And Rainbow Dash, who could not abandon her friends for her own heart's desire, represents the spirit of loyalty. The spirits of these 5 ponies got us through every challenge you threw at us.
You still don't have the 6th element. The spark didn't work.
But it did. A different kind of spark. I felt it the very moment I realized how happy I was to hear you, to see you, how much I cared about you. The spark ignited inside me when I realized that you all are my friends. You see, Nightmare Moon, when those elements are ignited by the spark that resides in the heart of us all, it creates the 6th element, the element of magic.
The answer is in the title. Friendship is magic. It is, perhaps for this reason, no wonder why the show attracted such an unexpectedly large audience of young adult men, the much maligned brony demographic, a group of largely sensitive young men who seem to have latched onto the series' emotionally enfranchising messages intended for little girls, but no less relevant to adult men. This is because adult men, being human beings, have feelings! What a concept! Feelings that they are often wrongly discouraged from expressing, discussing, acknowledging, or exploring in this culture, often with very negative results, an aspect of toxic masculinity that My Little Pony Friendship is Magic unexpectedly proved to be a very powerful antidote to. So my PSA to you is this: don't judge the bronies! Some of them might seem a bit weird on the surface, I acknowledge that, but the majority of them are just good guys taking a bold stance against toxic masculinity, by embracing something that they love and putting themselves at risk of ridicule in doing so, but unabashedly loving a thing which happens to be a highly pro-social, gender-positive show whose overarching message is about emotional understanding and acceptance. So understand them emotionally and accept them. But the discussion of My Little Pony actually brings me to the story of how the half-hour toy commercial came to an end. You may have noticed that, unlike in the 80s, the original My Little Pony toy line, the more recent Friendship is Magic toy line had a much smaller number of pony toys available for sale, whereas the original toy line had literally hundreds of ponies in it. In fact, so many that the exact number of how many G1 or first generation My Little Ponies were made is actually unknown due to poor record keeping for the international markets. All throughout the original Pony series, as well as on He-Man, G.I. Joe, and plenty of other 80s toy lines and many, many cartoons from this era, there were characters whose only role in the entire series was to walk on, say their name once, and then disappear forever from the series. And you know that, of course, there would be a toy of that character available in stores that the kids just had to have.
It's Megan and Sky Dancer.
I'm Baby Moon Dancer.
I'm Baby Surprise.
I'm Baby Glory. I'm Baby Cotton Candy.
Oh, look at you.
This worked really, really well on kids. So well, in fact, that it inspired legislation from Congress against this walk-on character with a toy practice, a little thing called the Children's Television Act of 1990. The Children's Television Act of 1990, which in fact I think I'm going to make a vocabulary term. The Children's Television Act of 1990. I studied this legislation heavily, actually, for my master's degree research, particularly the complaints from parents to the FCC and Congress that led to its establishment. The Angry Parent Brigade basically revolted against the predominance of children's programming meant solely to sell toys, rather than provide useful educational content for children. The kinds of demands typically expressed in parents' letters include, of course, no more walk-on characters with tie-in toys. Interestingly, no more low-quality, low-budget animation. Apparently, the cheaper, more limited animation styles of 80s cartoons, as we've seen in He-Man and My Little Pony, seem to have offended the parental generation of the 80s to what I consider a kind of surprising degree. I mean, it's nowhere near as bad as Clutch Cargo.
Overlooker, Clutch Cargo!
I remain a little mystified as to why this was such a commonly expressed concern among these letters, but my best guess is that maybe this generation of parents grew up with, you know, fluid, high-quality animation like Warner Brothers and Disney as their default and felt that their kids just deserved better than this limited animation television stuff. Another interesting thing of note is that there was not very much complaining about 80s cartoons in terms of pro-social story content from these parental complaints. The chief complaints parents seem to have had were mainly focused on the low-budget animation styles and, of course, the overzealous pushing of walk-on and other toy characters at the expense of educational or otherwise useful content. I find this fascinating. But regardless of the apparent parental satisfaction with the appropriately pro-social story content of He-Man, My Little Pony, Jem and the Holograms, Rainbow Bright, G.I. Joe, and many others, the Children's Television Act of 1990 nevertheless required stations to dedicate a portion of their children's show blocks to educational content, thus ushering in the golden age of children's television, the 1990s. Perhaps the biggest two stipulations of the Children's Television Act of 1990 are the limits imposed on the amount of commercial content allowed within children's programming blocks, effectively ending the era of the half-hour toy commercial for obvious reasons, and the requirement for children's shows to provide a certain amount of core programming. Here's a quote from the FCC website under the heading Children's Educational Television to explain what core programming is. Core programming is specifically designed to serve the educational and informational needs of children 16 years of age and under, including the child's intellectual/cognitive or social/emotional needs. In addition, core programming serves the educational and informational needs of children as a significant purpose, is at least 30 minutes long with some exceptions made for short PSAs. Is aired between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. Is a regularly scheduled weekly program with exceptions made for TV specials. Commercial television stations must provide information identifying educational programs for children to publishers of programming guides and TV listings. That's the end of the FCC quote. This legislation from the FCC ushered in a series of new shows in the 1990s, in addition to the small handful of existing children's programming that had come about prior to 1990, such as Reading Rainbow, as we discussed, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and of course Sesame Street, that already fulfilled these criteria. Newcomers included Captain Planet, Bill Nye the Science Guy, Beakman's World, Power Rangers, Animaniacs, Tiny Toon Adventures, Doug, Hey Arnold, Recess, and many, many others. While many of these shows pushed pro-social messages of varying types, educational content, and often racially diverse casts, very 90s thing, we see yet again a return to the gender-neutral but leaning male child audience throughout these programs. Shows tend to be either completely gender-neutral or have male protagonists with female side characters, as we have seen previously in pre-1980s decades. At the beginning of the 1990s, a real fear of networks losing their broadcaster licenses, thanks to the new FCC regulations, meant a serious, if ultimately temporary, decommercialization of children's television media, both in shows and advertisement blocks, as well as a huge push towards developing more shows with educational and pro-social content, shows which tended to have a gender-neutral or male-leaning audience. This ultimately removed the incentive to pander to the female child audience, as hawking She-Ra dolls and My Little Pony toys was now suddenly something stations were wary of. Without toy sales, there was no longer a monetary incentive towards courting an explicitly female target demographic in children's television. For better or for worse, however, this doesn't last very long, because gradually throughout the late 90s and early 2000s, children's show creators begin to realize that the FCC was not actually enforcing the Children's Television Act of 1990, and that the bar for pro-social content was actually pretty low. For example, the 2007 cartoon show Chowder famously passed itself off as fulfilling core programming requirements by having a main character who liked to eat food. Supposedly a pro-social message to encourage kids to try new foods. Personally, I don't buy it. I'm not entirely sure why that was allowed to count as core programming educational content on the level of things like Bill Nye the Science Guy and Beakman's World, but that's the kind of thing that illustrates the slackening of children's television's educational standards throughout the past couple of decades. A good demonstration of this gradually increasing awareness on the part of show creators throughout the 90s is the famous Wheel of Morality segment on 1993's Animaniacs, a show that pushed the envelope even early on and got away with a lot more than other shows thanks to its parent-pleasing, high-quality animation style, and perhaps also to the fact that it was executive produced by Steven Spielberg. Let's take a look at the very self-aware, very tongue-in-cheek segment that came at the end of each Animaniacs episode, The Wheel of Morality.
It's that time again.
To send away for the free brochure?
To discuss how cute I am?
No, it's time to learn the day's lesson.
No!
Hey, come on! The Wheel of Morality adds boring educational value to what would otherwise be an almost entirely entertaining program.
But the morals make no sense.
It's totally bogus.
Who came up with this stupid Wheel of Morality idea anyway?
The execs at the Fox Kids Network.
Oh! They did? What a great idea!
Yeah, I love the Wheel of Morality.
So, Wheel of Morality, turn, turn, turn. Tell us the lesson that we should learn. Moral number 1. And the moral of today's story is... brush your teeth after every meal. This moral brought to you by the American Dental Association.
Which brings us to where we are today. Thanks in part to the leniency of the enforcement of the Children's Television Act of 1990, shows that sold toys to little girls gradually came back over the last few decades, resulting in the return of shows and related toy lines targeted towards little girls. Things from My Little Pony Friendship is Magic, the reboot show that we talked about, and Monster High, both from the year 2010, or starting then and going on from there, to DC Superhero Girls and the She-Ra reboot, both starting in 2018 and 2019 respectively, and many others. Noticeably, these shows focus less on selling toys and more on telling stories, tend to avoid having walk-on characters who say their names and then disappear forever with a toy about them, and sell a relatively limited number of dolls and figures compared to the endless onslaught of new variations promoted in the 1980s cartoon shows. It seems almost as if toy companies that are creating television shows are extra wary of blowing it after what happened in the 1980s, so they're not pushing the envelope as far as toy sales go quite as far as they originally had. They are coyly selling toys, but not too many, just to keep their business model going without pushing the envelope too hard and inviting government censorship. So throughout this story, turning back to the world of film, we've also seen in, recent decades, a significant rise in feature films, especially Disney animations, with female, usually princess, protagonists post-1980. Snow White, Cinderella, and Sleeping Beauty all predate this, of course, but looking back at Disney's overall film catalog, they actually stand out as the exceptions in a long list of both animated and live-action films featuring male protagonists until The Little Mermaid comes around and changes things up in 1989. Which is, of course, after the marketability of the female child audience was firmly established by television. The Little Mermaid basically begins a surge of new Disney princesses that begin to come out from 1989 on every few years. The vast majority of Disney princess films that exist happen after the success of The Little Mermaid in 1989. There's Beauty and the Beast from 1991, Jasmine, who is not the focus but is the princess in Aladdin of 1992, Pocahontas from 95, Mulan in 1998, so that's 4 spreading throughout that whole decade. Then a noticeable drop-off in production for about 10 years as Disney negotiated its notoriously poorly handled and mercenary transition into computer-generated animation production, with 2009's The Princess and the Frog, an excellent film, and the first example of a black Disney princess, unfortunately being the film that Disney chose to blame for disbanding their entire hand-drawn animation department when the Oscar went to Up, a CG film, instead of Princess and the Frog, a hand-drawn animation. This basically ended an ongoing, robust hand-drawn animation production studio that had been active since the 1920s in one fell swoop. So that, of course, transitions us into the era of Disney computer-generated princesses with 2010's Tangled, 2012's Brave, and the more successful Frozen of 2013, 2016's Moana, and last year's Frozen 2, a rare example of a Disney sequel receiving a theatrical release. This illustrates a disproportionate balance of over 10 Disney princesses coming into existence over the last 31 years post-1989, with only the first 3 original Disney princesses spanning the entire 52 years of Disney feature film history prior to this moment. It should also be noted, of course, that the vast majority of these princesses, especially the earlier ones, are mostly examples of compromised feminism in one way or another, and only a very small number of the most recent princess installments, like Moana, Merida, Anna, and Elsa, really emerge as relatively uncompromised feministic portrayals. Now, considering what we've learned from the Judith Van Evera reading, perhaps this points to a more serious issue within our cultural history, the fact that generations of little girls have grown up either in media deserts for girls that pandered mainly or only to boys, received decades worth of mixed message compromised feminism from both TV and film meant for children, and when they were finally considered as a legitimate demographic, it unfortunately came with a somewhat predatory focus on their easily manipulated childhood trust and purchasing power as consumers. Not exactly a triumphant or progressive story, though at least the last part of it applies equally to boys as easily manipulated toy consumers. I should also mention that in the relatively new advent of streaming services, FCC guidelines surrounding children's television do not apply, and children's content on streaming services goes relatively unregulated, even compared to the unenforced formality regulations that are, imposed on TV as we currently have them. So, that's about it for now. Your assignment is due by midnight tonight under the discussion tab of Web Campus, and again, you must respond politely and professionally to at least one other student's comment in order to receive full credit. Before I go, I just wanted to give you a heads up about the final exam. The final exam will be taking place on Web Campus, not next week, but the week after. We have one more class. It'll be on Web Campus, probably under the Assignments tab, like your quizzes. I'll give you more specifics, once we're closer to the date, probably in our next class. It will be live on Tuesday, May 5th, which is 1 week after our next meeting, from 5:30 to 8 p.m., just like our real usual scheduled class time as if we were meeting in person. So, don't make crazy Cinco de Mayo plans that start before 8 p.m. Be sober when you take the final exam. As I've said before, the final will be cumulative and will include all vocabulary terms, periods of film history, and other discussion topics and concepts covered in all of our class meetings together. It'll be in the same format as the midterm, with a vocab section, short answer, and one open-ended essay for which there will be multiple options available for you to choose from. As before, choose only one essay question to answer, and be aware that the exam, like your quizzes, will be timed and will auto-submit after the time limit has passed. The time limit is super long, though. It's 2.5 hours. Like for the midterm, it's the entire, theoretical post-class period. So this theoretically shouldn't be too much of a problem. You should have plenty of time. I think that's all for now. You have your assignment. You know when it's due. You're ready for whatever comes next, and good luck on it. I'll catch you on the flip side.
Call up on the sea ponies when you're in distress. Whoa! Helpful as can be.